35. Forest of Dean. 2019. That number sat in my notes the same way 30 did, the way the bison number did, before Siberia. A small figure, almost administrative. I wrote it down while I was still processing what the permafrost data implied, filed it under conservation releases, and moved on. The official description was reasonable enough. A Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust reintroduction program. 35 pine martens radio-collared and translocated from the Scottish Highlands into an ancient woodland on the English-Welsh border. A species recovery effort. Routine, in the way these things are described as routine. I accepted that. I didn't look further. Then, in April 2026, Natural England published a report. It did not receive the coverage I would have expected. What it stated, in language that was not ambiguous, was that under a do-nothing scenario, the red squirrel, the native squirrel of Britain, an animal that has occupied this island for 8,000 years, will be functionally extinct on the English mainland within 25 years. I read it as a standard conservation alarm, the kind of document that gets filed and discussed and ultimately produces very little. I almost moved past it. Then I noticed the date of the Forest of Dean release again, 2019. And I noticed something the report mentioned only briefly, in a passage that most readers would not stop at. In the areas where the 35 martens had established territory, the gray squirrel population had not declined in the way populations typically decline, gradually, measurably, in response to pressure. In those specific areas, within approximately 24 months, the gray squirrel had effectively vanished. I want to be careful about what I am claiming here, because the claim matters. I am not saying 35 animals solved a 150-year ecological crisis. I am saying that in the zones where these specific predators were present, a species that had dominated English woodland for over a century, a species that outnumbers the red squirrel by approximately 25-1 across Britain, appeared to simply stop existing, and the data from the field offered one detail I could not set down. Before the collapse, the gray squirrel's home ranges had expanded, not contracted, expanded. In ecology, that is a signature of fear, an animal moving further, searching harder, fleeing something it cannot locate. These animals were responding to a threat they had no evolutionary experience of, a predator that had been absent from this landscape for 160 years. Hold that, because the question that follows from it is not the one the conservation reports are asking. The question I could not stop returning to was simpler and, I think, more unsettling. If 35 animals did in 24 months what a century of human intervention has failed to do, what does that tell us about the nature of the invasion we thought we understood? The last investigation ended in Siberia with a number. This one begins in England with the same kind of number, and I suspect it ends in the same place all of these investigations end, somewhere the official record didn't think to look. The gray squirrel arrived in Britain in 1876. A wedding gift, the record states, brought from North America to Henbury Park in Cheshire by a man named Thomas Brocklehurst, who appears to have understood nothing of what he was releasing. By 1930, the native red squirrel had been legislated against on its own behalf. The gray had moved that fast. Today, the Forestry Commission estimates the annual damage to British timber at £37 million. Not from disease, not from weather, but from one species stripping bark from broadleaf trees in a pattern that kills them from the outside in. Remember that method. Here is the biological problem, and it is a strange one. The gray squirrel has no learned fear of the pine marten, not because martens aren't dangerous, they are exceptionally dangerous, but because these two species have not shared a landscape for long enough for that fear to be encoded. The gray arrived in 1876. The marten was functionally gone from England shortly after. They never overlapped, which means the gray squirrel, for all its adaptability, carries a specific and catastrophic blind spot. It cannot recognize the thing that is about to end it. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. We're looking at data the mainstream narrative treats as a footnote. Now back to the fear response. Because a researcher in Ireland noticed something in the field data that nobody had expected. Dr. Emma Sheehy published her findings in 2014, drawing on survey data from Ireland and Scotland. What she found, and what the conservation community apparently struggled to process quietly, was a consistent inverse correlation. Wherever pine marten populations were recovering, gray squirrel populations were collapsing. Not declining, collapsing. The word she used in subsequent interviews was rapid. The scientific community's response, by several accounts, was something close to disbelief. Let me say that carefully. The data suggested a single recovering native predator was doing what coordinated, government-funded culling programs had spent decades failing to do. But Sheehy also noticed something else. The red squirrels, in those same zones, were coming back. This is the part that stopped me, because the obvious concern, the one any reasonable person raises, is that a recovering predator capable of collapsing gray squirrel populations would simply do the same to the reds. That is the intuitive fear. It is also, the evidence suggests, precisely wrong. Red squirrels and pine martens have coexisted on these islands for thousands of years. The red is lighter, faster, and spends significantly more time in the upper canopy, out of marten range. It has had millennia to learn the rules of this particular game. The gray has had none, which raises the question the Forest of Dean data was about to answer directly. The tracking data from the Forest of Dean covers the period 2019 to 2021. What it shows, zone by zone, is not a gradual thinning. It shows presence, then absence. The gray squirrel camera trap detections drop, and in the core, marten territories, they do not recover. 24 months. A species that had held this woodland for generations, gone. I want to be careful not to overstate what I know. This is one forest. The martens numbered 35. But the pattern it produced matches Sheehy's Irish data with a precision that is difficult to dismiss. If these patterns of ecological recovery are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes for institutional silence to hold. Now, back to the Forest of Dean, because the data points toward a conclusion that reframes everything we thought we knew about intervention. Here is what the investigation has produced. A species arrives in 1876 with no predators and no fear. It dismantles a native ecosystem over 150 years, while government programs spend decades and tens of millions of pounds attempting to slow it. Then, in 2019, 35 animals are released into one forest, and within 24 months, in the zones those animals occupy, the invader is gone. Not reduced, gone. And the species it displaced for a century begins, quietly, to return. I don't know what to do with that. I want to be honest about that. I have been sitting with this data for months, and I am not prepared to tell you what it means at scale. Whether the pattern holds across different woodlands, different marten densities, different configurations of landscape, I don't know. What I know is what the data shows in the places where it exists. And what I cannot stop thinking about is this. A century of human intervention failed. 35 animals, reintroduced to one ancient woodland, did not. The 1876 release, the 37 million pounds, the blind spot encoded into a species that never learned to be afraid. Sheehy's correlation, the camera traps going dark, the red squirrels coming back. Once you see the shape of it, it is difficult to see anything else. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. The demolition of a century-old barrier in Scotland, and what the models say happens next. I think I'm ready now. See you there. If this series is raising questions for you, leave them below. I read everything. The pattern becomes clearer the more eyes are on it. 35 animals, 24 months. One ancient woodland, and a question that 150 years of intervention never thought to ask.